Grease under the fingernails never really washes out. It just settles deep into the creases, much like a bad reputation. When the phone rang over the grinding hum of an angle grinder, Silas almost ignored it. A call at 3 in the afternoon on a Tuesday meant trouble, usually from a brother sitting in a holding cell. But the cracked screen flashed Riverside Middle, coach. It was about Toby. His kid brother had been limping for a week, and nobody had bothered to tell him. The clubhouse garage smelled like stale beer, ozone, and the sharp metallic tang of hot iron. Silas knelt on a piece of flattened cardboard, wrenching a stubborn bolt on the primary drive of a '78 shovelhead. Sweat stung the corner of his left eye. He blinked it away, refusing to wipe his face with hands coated in motor oil and metallic sludge. His phone vibrated against his thigh, a muffled buzz swallowed by the heavy bass of a southern rock track blasting from a blown-out stereo in the corner. He ignored it. It stopped. Then, 10 seconds later, it started again. Silas cursed, dropping the heavy wrench onto the concrete with a loud clank. He wiped his hands on a filthy red shop rag, leaving dark smears across the fabric, and dug into his denim pocket. "Yeah," Silas barked into the receiver, his voice rough from cheap cigarettes and lack of sleep. "Am I speaking to Mr. Hayes?" The voice on the other end was thin, reedy. It belonged to a man who wore khakis and tucked his shirts in. "Just Silas. Who is this?" "This is Coach Miller. Greg Miller, over at Riverside, Toby's football coach." Silas's jaw tightened. His grip on the phone shifted, knuckles whitening under the grease. Toby was 14. 14 and quiet. Too quiet for the world they lived in, a kid trying to navigate the jagged edges of a life he hadn't asked for. Silas had taken custody of him 2 years ago when their mother finally traded her responsibilities for a needle and a bus ticket out of state. "What did he do?" Silas asked. He didn't ask if Toby was hurt. His first instinct, bred by years wearing the winged death head on his back, was defensive. "He didn't do anything wrong, Mr. Hayes. It's just, I'm concerned." Coach Miller paused. Silas could hear the faint, shrill blast of a whistle in the background. "Toby has been limping all week, badly. At first I thought he just tweaked his ankle in drills. But he's dragging his right leg like it's made of lead. He refuses to see the school nurse, says it's nothing. But today, he couldn't even manage a light jog. He nearly collapsed on the 40-yard line." Silas stared at a patch of spilled oil on the concrete. The iridescent colors swirled in the dim garage light. All week, a flare of hot, unreasonable anger spiked in Silas's chest. He wasn't angry at the coach. He was angry at Toby, angry at the kid for being weak, for hiding it, for making Silas feel this sudden suffocating grip of panic that he immediately shoved down into the pit of his stomach. Bikers didn't panic. They handled things. "Did you take his pads off?" Silas's voice dropped an octave, the gravel in his throat scraping against the syllables. "Did you look at his leg?" "I tried," Miller stammered, clearly uncomfortable. "He wouldn't let me. He got extremely defensive. Honestly, Mr. Hayes, I didn't want to force the issue. He's a private boy." "He's terrified," Silas translated silently. "I'll be there in 15 minutes, Silas said. "We practice until—" Silas hung up. He shoved the phone back into his pocket and stood, his knees popping in the damp air of the garage. Gage, a heavy-set brother with a braided beard and a scar splitting his left eyebrow, looked up from a dismantled carburetor on the adjacent workbench. "Trouble?" Gage asked, his tone flat. "Toby," Silas grunted. Gage didn't ask anything else. He just nodded, reaching for a flathead screwdriver. "Take the back roads. Cops are running a speed trap on Route 9. Silas grabbed his cut from the back of a metal folding chair. The heavy leather was stiff with age and weather, the bottom rocker displaying the name of his state, the center patch holding the iconic skull of the Hells Angels. He slid it over his gray t-shirt. The weight of it settled on his shoulders. A second skin, a target, a shield. He didn't wash his hands. He grabbed his helmet, kicked his Dyna into neutral, and hit the ignition. The exhaust roared, vibrating through the concrete floor, loud enough to rattle the cheap windows of the garage doors. He slammed it into gear and rolled out into the blinding afternoon sun, the heavy thrum of the V-twin engine matching the sudden, erratic pounding in his chest. The transition from the industrial South Side to the manicured tree-lined streets of Riverside was always jarring. Silas hated this part of town. The air smelled different here. It lacked the grit of diesel exhaust and frying food, replaced by the sterile manufactured scent of cut grass, hot asphalt, and sprinkler water. He kept the throttle open, weaving through the late afternoon traffic. The wind beat against his face, hot and dry. His mind raced, cataloging possibilities. Toby wasn't a reckless kid. He didn't ride dirt bikes, didn't climb fences, didn't pull stupid stunts. If he was hurt, someone had hurt him. Silas downshifted as he approached the high school, the exhaust popping with a harsh, aggressive crackle that turned the heads of two women loading groceries into a Volvo SUV. He ignored their wide-eyed stares. He was used to the fear, the judgment. He weaponized it when he needed to, but right now it was just background noise. He pulled his bike over the curb and parked it right on the sidewalk adjacent to the practice field, entirely ignoring the paved visitor lot 100 yards away. The kickstand scraped against the concrete. He killed the engine. The sudden silence was heavy, broken only by the ticking of the cooling metal beneath him. He swung his leg over the saddle, hanging his helmet on the handlebars. The football field was sprawling, aggressively green under the harsh afternoon sun. Boys in white helmets and blue practice jerseys were running hitting drills on the far side. The sharp clack of plastic shoulder pads colliding echoed across the turf. Silas walked toward the chain-link fence. His heavy leather boots crunched on the gravel, a steady, deliberate rhythm. He felt the eyes on him immediately. A couple of mothers sitting in folding chairs near the bleachers stopped talking. A referee intern lowered his flag. The winged death head on Silas's back wasn't a fashion statement here. It was an invasion. He found the gate, pushed it open, and stepped onto the grass. Coach Miller was easy to spot. He was pacing near the 50-yard line, holding a clipboard like it was a shield, a whistle dangling from a lanyard around his neck. When he saw Silas approaching, Miller froze. Silas didn't hurry. He never hurried. Hurrying showed desperation. He closed the distance with a slow, rolling gait, his thumbs hooked loosely into the pockets of his denim jeans. As he got closer, he could see the sweat beading on Miller's forehead. The man looked to be in his late 20s, fresh out of a sports science program, soft around the middle and utterly out of his depth. "Mr. Hayes?" Miller asked as Silas stopped 2 feet away. Up close, Silas towered over him, radiating the smells of the garage: oil, old sweat, tobacco, and heat. "Where is he?" Silas asked, bypassing the handshake Miller had half started to initiate. Miller swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He pointed toward the aluminum bleachers on the sidelines. "Over there, on the bench. I pulled him from the scrimmage." Silas turned his head. Sitting alone on the bottom tier of the bleachers, hunched over with his elbows resting on his knees, was Toby. The kid looked small. His jersey was untucked, smudged with dirt, and his helmet sat on the grass beside him. His right leg was extended stiffly in front of him. "I tried to talk to him again before you got here," Miller offered defensively, stepping slightly backward as if he feared Silas might swing at him. "He just shut down, wouldn't look at me. He doesn't like cops," Silas said flatly. "I'm a coach, not a cop." To him, it's the same thing. People with whistles who tell him what to do. Silas didn't look back at Miller. His eyes were locked on his brother. "You let him limp around your field for a week?" "I didn't notice at first," Miller protested, his voice pitching higher. "They get banged up. It's football. They hide it because they want to play. It wasn't until today that I realized he couldn't put any weight on it." Silas ground his teeth together. The muscle in his jaw jumped. He hated this feeling. The civilian world was supposed to be safe for Toby. That was the deal Silas made with himself. Silas handled the violence, the club, the dirt, so Toby could play a stupid game on a green field and worry about math tests. Stay here, Silas ordered. He didn't wait for the coach's response. He walked toward the bleachers, his boots sinking slightly into the soft turf. As Silas approached, Toby didn't look up. The boy was staring a hole into the scuffed toes of his cleats. His shoulders were tense, pulled up near his ears. He looked exactly like their mother did when she was caught in a lie, bracing for an impact that was inevitably coming. "Get up," Silas said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the ambient noise of the practice field with heavy authority. Toby flinched. He finally raised his head. The boy had Silas's dark eyes, but none of the hardness. His face was streaked with sweat and dirt, and there was a tight, pinched look around his mouth. "Hey, why?" Toby muttered, his voice barely a rasp. He didn't move to stand. "I said get up." Toby gripped the edge of the aluminum bench. He shifted his weight, trying to push off his left leg, completely avoiding the right. He managed to get to his feet, but a sharp breath hissed through his teeth, and he immediately leaned heavily against the bleacher railing, his face drained of color. Silas stepped closer, invading the kid's space. He looked down at the boy's right leg. Toby was wearing standard issue padded football pants, tight against the thigh. "Coach says you've been dragging that leg all week," Silas said, his tone conversational but laced with a dangerous undercurrent. "Says you won't let the nurse look at it." "It's nothing," Toby lied. He looked away, staring past Silas toward the parking lot. "Just pulled a muscle. Coach is making a big deal out of nothing." "Look at me." Toby swallowed, slowly bringing his eyes back to his brother's face. "You lie to me again. I'm dragging you by your ear to the bike," Silas said softly. "What happened to the leg, Tobe?" "I fell." Silas didn't sigh. He didn't show the exhaustion that suddenly weighed on his bones. He just reached out. His grease-stained hand clamped down on Toby's right thigh, just above the knee. Toby let out a choked, guttural noise, a half-scream swallowed by pride. His knees buckled. Silas caught him by the shoulder pads, holding him upright with one arm. The boy was trembling violently, tears instantly pooling in the corners of his eyes, though he fought to blink them back. "That's not a pulled muscle," Silas said, his voice dropping to a low rumble. He kept his grip on Toby's shoulder, feeling the rigid, cheap plastic of the pads. "That feels like bone-deep bruising, maybe a hairline fracture. Let's see it." "No, don't." Toby tried to pull away, but Silas's grip was iron. "Drop the pants, Toby, now, or I cut them off you right here in front of the whole damn team." Toby stared at him, breathing hard. He knew Silas wasn't bluffing. Silas never bluffed. With shaking hands, Toby reached down to the waistband of his practice pants. He popped the plastic belt and slid the tight spandex blend fabric down his thighs. Silas knelt in the grass. The smell of sour athletic sweat hit his nose, but it was entirely overridden by the sight in front of him. Toby's right thigh, extending from the middle of his quad down to the top of his kneecap, was a horrific canvas of trauma. The skin was mottled with deep, ugly shades of violet, black, and a sickening, sickly yellow at the edges. It wasn't one bruise. It was a cluster of overlapping contusions, angry and swollen. The shape of the bruising told a story that made the blood roar in Silas's ears. These weren't tackle marks. They weren't from a fall. They were blunt force impacts, long, linear, overlapping, like a piece of piping or a heavy boot. Repeatedly. Silas hovered his fingers over the darkest part of the bruising, feeling the unnatural heat radiating from the skin. The muscle was rigid, spasming slightly under the trauma. "Who?" Silas asked. He didn't look up. His voice sounded disconnected, hollowed out by the sudden violent rage pooling in his gut. "Nobody," Toby whispered. He was shivering, despite the 8-degree heat. "I fell off my bike." "You don't ride a bike, Toby." Silas stood up. He looked down at the 14-year-old boy, seeing the fear vibrating in every muscle. Toby pulled his pants back up quickly, hiding the damage, trying to salvage whatever dignity he had left. "It was just some guys, okay? Just some older guys. I don't even know them. Bullshit! Silas stepped into the boy's space, forcing Toby to look up at him. You don't walk around limping for a week, hiding it from me, for randoms. You know exactly who it is, and you know why. Toby's lower lip trembled. The tough guy facade, the one he tried so hard to emulate from watching Silas and the club, cracked violently. They cornered me behind the gym, Toby stammered, the words spilling out now that the dam was broken. 3 of them. Seniors. They told me I needed to pay a toll to walk on their turf. Silas stared at him. The suburbs. It was always the pristine, quiet places that bred the worst kind of arrogant cruelty. A toll? Yeah, $10 a day. I didn't have it on Tuesday, so they held me against the brick wall. One of them had a steel pipe, just a small one. He hit my leg. Said if I told the teachers, they'd break my knee next time. And you didn't tell me, Silas said, the betrayal cutting deeper than he expected. You live in a house with a patched member of the Hells Angels, and you let 3 high school kids extort you for lunch money. They said they knew who you were. Toby shot back, his voice finally raising, cracking with adolescent emotion. The leader, a guy named Carter, he said his dad is a cop. He said if I brought my trash biker brother to the school, his dad would have you locked up for parole violation. I didn't want you to go back to jail. Why? I can handle it. Silas stared at his kid brother. The boy was in agonizing pain, terrified, and swallowing a daily beating, all to protect Silas's precarious freedom. Silas felt a bitter, acidic taste in the back of his throat. He reached out and grabbed the back of Toby's neck, squeezing the base of his skull firmly, a rough approximation of affection. You're a dumbass, Toby, Silas said quietly. Toby sniffled, looking down. Get your helmet, Silas commanded. We're going to the hospital to get an x-ray on that leg. What about practice? You're done with practice. For a while, Silas turned around. Coach Miller was standing exactly where Silas had left him, watching them with wide, nervous eyes. Silas walked back toward him, his boots heavy on the grass. He's got a deep contusion, maybe a fracture, Silas said as he reached the coach. He's off the roster until a doctor clears him. Of course, Miller nodded rapidly. I'll note it. Did he tell you how it happened? Silas looked at Miller. He looked at the clipboard, the whistle, the neat khakis. The total utter uselessness of authority when real cruelty was happening right under its nose. He fell, Silas said, his eyes dead and unreadable. Right. Yes. Fell. Miller backed up a step. Silas walked past him, heading toward the gate. Toby limped along behind him, struggling to keep pace, dragging his right foot through the grass. When they reached the sidewalk, Silas picked up his helmet but didn't put it on. He looked over the seat of his Harley, out toward the high school building in the distance. The bell was going to ring in an hour. Seniors would be walking out to the parking lot. A kid named Carter. Cop's son. Silas pulled his phone back out of his grease-stained pocket. He dialed a number. It rang once. Yeah. Gage's voice came through the speaker. Bring the van, Silas said, watching Toby lean against the chain-link fence, clutching his leg. To the high school. Toby needs a ride to the clinic. On it, Gage said. You need anything else? Silas traced the worn leather of his thumb against the edge of his phone casing. He looked back at the manicured lawns, the pristine facades of the suburban paradise. Yeah, Silas said, his voice dropping into a register that held no warmth, only a cold, mechanical certainty. Call the clubhouse. Tell them I need 3 guys to meet me at the Riverside High student parking lot. We're going to wait for the bell to ring. Gage arrived 12 minutes later. The transportation wasn't a bike, but the club's beat-up Ford Econoline. The van was a matte, primer gray, marred by rust around the wheel wells and sporting a cracked passenger side mirror held together by silver duct tape. It idled with a heavy, uneven rattle that sounded like a washing machine full of gravel. The sliding door screeches open, protesting on dry tracks. Gage stepped out, his heavy boots hitting the pavement. He didn't look at the high school, the sprawling green fields, or the terrified coach still standing on the 50-yard line. He looked at Toby. "Get in the back, kid," Gage said. His voice was a low, rumbling bass. It lacked any pity, which was exactly what Toby needed. Pity made the boy crumble. Routine held him together. Toby hobbled toward the van, his jaw tight. He grabbed the door frame, struggling to hoist his weight up without bending his right knee. Silas stepped forward, slipping a greasy hand under his brother's armpit, and hoisted him up onto the ribbed metal floorboard in one fluid motion. Toby sat heavily on the bench seat. The interior of the van smelled like stale cigarette smoke, damp dog fur, and the sharp tang of brake cleaner. It was a smell that meant home more than their actual apartment did. "You're making a mistake, Y," Toby said. His hands were gripping the frayed fabric of his football jersey. He looked pale in the dim light of the van's interior. "If he tells his dad—" "I don't care about his dad," Silas interrupted. He leaned into the doorway, resting his forearms on the dirty rubber weather stripping. He lowered his voice so only the boy could hear. "You let a threat dictate how you live, you spend the rest of your life on your knees. That's the civilian way. It ain't ours. You understand?" Toby swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing in his skinny throat. He didn't nod, but his eyes dropped. "Gage is taking you to the urgent care on 4th Street. Ask for Doc Henderson. He won't ask questions for the paperwork," Silas instructed, stepping back. "I'll meet you at the clubhouse." Gage slammed the sliding door shut with a definitive bang that echoed off the brick facade of the gymnasium. He gave Silas a single, curt nod, climbed into the driver's seat, and ground the van into gear. Silas watched it lumber down the street, trailing a thin plume of blue exhaust, until it disappeared around a row of manicured hedges. Silas stood alone on the sidewalk for exactly 3 minutes. Then the low, synchronized thunder began. It started as a vibration in the pavement, a heavy rhythmic thrumming that rattled the loose chain link of the fence. Then came the sound, the harsh, unbaffled roar of large displacement V-twin engines running hot. 3 bikes turned onto the street, riding in a tight, staggered formation. At the front was Russo. He was a wiry, heavily tattooed man who wore a dirty red bandana tied tightly around his skull. His bike was a stripped-down chopper with ape hangers that forced his arms up into a perpetual crucifixion pose. Behind him rode Dutch, a man the size of a commercial refrigerator, wearing a cut-off denim vest over a bare, sunburned chest. Bringing up the rear was Huck, the youngest of the 3, chewing on a matchstick, his eyes hidden behind mirrored aviator sunglasses. They didn't park on the street. They followed Silas's lead, hopping the curb and killing their engines in a staggered line right across the sole exit of the senior parking lot. The silence that followed was heavy, ringing in the ears. "Nice neighborhood," Russo said, swinging a long leg over his seat. He spat a wad of brown tobacco juice onto the pristine concrete. "Smells like fabric softener and taxes. What's the play, brother?" Silas pulled a crushed pack of Marlboros from his jeans. He tapped a cigarette out, clamped it between his teeth, and sparked his Zippo. He took a long drag, letting the harsh smoke fill his lungs, feeling the familiar burn ground him. "A kid named Carter," Silas said, exhaling a cloud of gray smoke into the hot, windless air. "Shook Toby down for lunch money, took a pipe to his leg when he couldn't pay." Dutch cracked his knuckles. It sounded like thick branches snapping in the quiet afternoon. "How old?" "Senior, probably 18. "Old enough to know better," Huck mumbled around his matchstick, leaning back against the hot leather of his saddle. "Old enough to bleed." "His old man is local PD," Silas added. The information didn't elicit a gasp. It didn't even cause a flinch. Russo just smiled, a thin, wolfish pulling of his lips that showed a chipped incisor. "Well, that just means he's used to Daddy fixing his messes. Guess Daddy ain't on shift today." Silas looked at the school. The large analog clock above the double-glass doors read 2:55 p.m. "We don't put him in the hospital," Silas ordered, his tone flat, stripping away any room for debate. "I don't need a task force knocking on the clubhouse door tomorrow morning. We don't break bones, but we make him understand the cost of doing business. We make him pay the toll." Russo nodded. Dutch crossed his massive arms. They settled in to wait. The heat radiating off the asphalt was intense. It baked through the soles of Silas's boots. The smell of melting tar mixed with the sharp scent of hot engine oil from the bikes. A few teachers walking between buildings spotted them. 4 men in heavy leather, patches proudly displayed, blocking the parking lot exit. The teachers stopped, stared, and immediately turned around, their pace quickening. Nobody came to ask them to leave. Fear was a highly effective perimeter. Silas felt the familiar, cold knot tightening in his gut. It was the same knot he felt before a raid, before a fight, before the heavy iron door of a cell slid shut. It was the physical manifestation of risk. He had 2 years of parole left. An assault charge, even a minor one, would violate him. He'd go back upstate. Toby would end up in the system, swallowed whole by foster care, chewed up and spat out exactly like their mother had been. Logic screamed at him to get on his bike and ride away, to let Toby handle it, to go to the principal, to be a civilian. Silas took another drag of his cigarette, tasting the ash. He crushed the logic down, suffocating it beneath a heavy blanket of pride and duty. If he let this go, Toby wasn't just a victim. He was a victim who belonged to a Hell's Angel. The disrespect was a contagion. If it spread, if the street learned that Silas Hayes let his blood get beaten with a pipe by a high schooler without consequence, Silas would lose his standing. And in their world, standing was the only currency that kept you alive. The analog clock clicked to 3 p.m. A sharp electronic bell shrieked through the PA system, cutting through the heavy suburban air. "Showtime," Russo muttered. The double glass doors of the high school burst open, vomiting a chaotic, brightly colored tide of teenagers into the afternoon sun. The noise was instantaneous, a cacophony of laughter, shouting, the clacking of skateboard wheels, and the heavy thud of backpacks being dropped. The air immediately filled with the synthetic, sickeningly sweet smell of strawberry and mango vape smoke. The kids flooded down the concrete steps, a herd of unbothered youth moving toward the parking lot. Then, the front line of the herd noticed the blockade. The ripple effect was fascinating to watch. It started with a group of girls in cheerleading uniforms. They stopped abruptly, their laughter dying in their throats, as they took in the 4 massive motorcycles and the men leaning against them. The sudden stop caused a bottleneck. The chatter began to taper off, replaced by hushed, urgent whispers. "Who are they? Look at their jackets. Are those the Hell's Angels? Just keep walking, don't look at them." Cell phones slid out of pockets, held low, cameras recording secretly. Silas ignored them. He kept his eyes scanning the crowd, looking for the profile Toby had given him earlier in the week when the limp had first started. Tall, blonde undercut, wears a gold chain, drives a blacked-out Tacoma. The students created a wide 10-foot berth around the bikes as they filed toward their cars, pressing themselves against the far fence to avoid walking too close to Dutch. The tension was thick enough to chew. "There," Huck said quietly, not pointing, just tilting his chin. Silas tracked the movement. Coming down the steps, flanked by 2 other boys who walked slightly behind him like pilot fish, was Carter. He fit the description perfectly. He wore a crisp, pastel blue polo shirt, khaki shorts, and immaculate white sneakers. A thick gold chain rested against his collarbone. He was laughing loudly at something one of his friends had said, twirling a set of car keys around his index finger. He exuded the specific, toxic arrogance of a boy who had never been told no and had never suffered a consequence. Carter walked toward a lifted, matte black Toyota Tacoma parked in the first row. As he approached, he finally noticed the disruption. His laughing stopped. He saw the bottleneck of students. He saw the 4 bikes blocking the exit. And then he saw Silas staring directly at him. Carter's step faltered, just for a fraction of a second, but Silas caught it. He saw the sudden calculation in the kid's eyes, the rapid attempt to access if this threat applied to him. Carter puffed out his chest, squaring his shoulders. He nudged his two friends, and they continued walking toward the truck, trying to project a confidence that was suddenly brittle. Silas dropped his cigarette onto the asphalt and ground it out with the heavy heel of his boot. He pushed off his bike and began walking. Russo, Dutch, and Huck fell in behind him, a wedge of leather, denim, and muscle cutting through the lingering crowd of students. The high schoolers parted like water, scrambling to get out of the way. Carter reached the driver's side of his Tacoma. His hand fumbled slightly as he grabbed the door handle. He glanced over his shoulder. The four men were 20 feet away and closing fast. "Hey, Carter!" Silas called out. His voice wasn't a yell. It was a conversational rumble, but it carried effortlessly over the quiet parking lot. Carter froze. The two boys with him backed up, pressing their spines against the bed of the truck, their eyes darting wildly. Carter turned around. He forced a smirk onto his face, though the muscles in his cheek were twitching. "Do I know you, man?" "No," Silas said, stopping a mere 3 feet from the teenager. Up close, the kid smelled like expensive cologne and nervous sweat. He was tall, maybe 6'1", but he lacked the density of a grown man. He was all hollow frame and unearned swagger. "But you know my brother, Toby." The color drained from Carter's face in a rapid, visible sheet. The smirk vanished, replaced by a tight, panicked grimace. He swallowed hard, his eyes flicking to the death head patch on Silas's chest, then up to the scars on his face, then to the three massive men flanking him. I don't know who that is," Carter stammered, his voice jumping a full octave. "Lie to me, Carter, and I'll have Dutch rip the doors off this truck and beat you with them," Silas said softly. Dutch stepped forward, a terrible, joyful light in his eyes. Okay, I know him," Carter said quickly, raising his hands, his car keys jingling nervously. We just mess around. It's just a joke, man. Boys being boys." "A joke?" Silas tilted his head. "Taking a steel pipe to a 14-year-old's knee is a joke where you come from?" The two friends standing by the truck bed exchanged a terrified glance. Without a word, they slowly started edging away, moving toward the front of the truck, abandoning ship. Carter noticed them leaving, but was too paralyzed to stop them. "Look, I didn't mean to hurt him that bad," Carter pleaded, his voice cracking. The tough guy facade had completely evaporated, leaving behind a terrified, soft kid. He was supposed to pay the toll. Everyone pays the toll. It's just how it works here. A toll. Silas repeated the word, tasting the absurdity of it. He stepped directly into Carter's personal space. His chest nearly brushed the kid's polo shirt. "You're extorting freshmen for lunch money and your daddy wears a badge. That's a hell of a business model." "My dad is a lieutenant," Carter said, a desperate, pathetic attempt to play his only trump card. His chest was heaving. "You touch me, he'll have the whole department down on your club. He knows who you people are." Silas didn't blink. He didn't smile. He just stared into the boy's terrified blue eyes, letting the silence stretch until the tension was unbearable. He could hear Carter's ragged breathing. He could smell the fear rolling off him in waves, completely overpowering the cologne. "Your dad is a lieutenant," Silas finally said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "I'm a 2-time felon with a violent history and nothing to lose. Who do you think is going to act faster right now?" Carter's lower lip began to tremble. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. "Please." Silas's hand shot out. It was a blur of motion. He didn't throw a punch. He grabbed Carter by the throat. Silas's thick, grease-stained fingers clamped around the kid's neck, squeezing just hard enough to cut off his air, but not enough to crush the windpipe. He slammed Carter backward. The kid's spine hit the door of the Tacoma with a loud, hollow thud. The truck rocked on its suspension. A collective gasp echoed from the remaining students scattered across the parking lot. Several girls screamed. "Silas," Russo warned quietly from behind him, keeping an eye on the crowd. "Keep it tight." Silas ignored him. He pressed his forearm against Carter's collarbone, pinning him to the hot metal of the truck. Carter was gasping, his hands flying up to claw ineffectively at Silas's thick wrist. The kid's pristine white sneakers scrabbled against the asphalt. "You think you're a predator?" Silas hissed, his face inches from Carter's. He could see the blown-out pupils, the absolute paralyzing terror in the boy's eyes. "You think because you got a pipe and a badge backing you up, you can hunt? You don't know what hunting is. You don't know what violence is. You're a tourist." Silas leaned his weight in, pressing Carter harder against the truck. The metal groaned. "Toby is my blood," Silas said, enunciating every word with glacial precision. "If you look at him again, if you speak to him, if you even walk down the same hallway as him, I won't come to the school. I will come to your house. I will sit in your living room. I will wait for your father to get off shift, and I will show both of you what a real monster looks like. Do you understand me?" Carter couldn't speak. He was turning a mottled shade of red, tears streaming down his cheeks, snot bubbling from his nose. He nodded frantically, his head thumping against the tinted window of the truck. Silas released his grip. Carter collapsed onto the asphalt, falling to his hands and knees. He gagged, coughing violently as oxygen rushed back into his lungs. He knelt there, gasping, the crisp polo shirt now stained with grease from Silas's hands and dust from the parking lot. Silas looked down at him. The disgust in his gut was a heavy, rotting thing. "The pipe," Silas commanded. "Where is it?" Carter pointed a shaking, trembling finger toward the bed of the truck, between gasps of air. Huck stepped over, reached over the side of the truck bed, and pulled out a 2-foot length of galvanized steel plumbing pipe. He weighed it in his hand, tapping it against his palm. "Heavy," Huck noted. "Give it here," Silas said. Huck tossed it. Silas caught it midair. The steel was warm from sitting in the sun. He looked at the pipe, thinking of the ugly mottled yellow and purple bruising running down Toby's leg. The heat in Silas's chest flared, demanding blood. It demanded he take the pipe and shatter Carter's kneecap. It demanded a permanent consequence. Silas gripped the pipe until his knuckles turned white. He looked at Carter, who was cowering on the ground, his arms wrapped around his head in a pathetic fetal crouch. Silas lowered the pipe. He didn't hit the boy. Breaking him wouldn't fix Toby. It would only validate the cycle they were all trapped in. Instead, Silas turned toward the matte black Tacoma. He gripped the pipe with both hands, raised it high over his shoulder, and brought it down with devastating, explosive force onto the hood of the truck. Crash! The sound was a gunshot. The heavy steel caved the hood in, shattering the locking mechanism and leaving a deep, jagged crater in the pristine metal. Carter screamed, flinching violently on the ground. Silas raised the pipe again. He swung it sideways, catching the passenger side headlight. The plastic casing exploded into a shower of white and amber shards that rained across the asphalt. Smash! He stepped to the side, driving the pipe into the side mirror, shearing it completely off the doorframe. It dangled by a few colored wires, bouncing against the side panel. Breathing heavily, a sheen of sweat on his forehead, Silas tossed the steel pipe onto the ground. It clattered loudly, rolling until it hit Carter's white sneaker. Silas looked down at the boy. Carter was sobbing openly now, his hands covering his face, his shoulders shaking with absolute humiliation in front of 50 of his peers. "That's the toll," Silas said, his voice cold and steady. $10 a day wouldn't cover the paint job." Silas turned around. He didn't look at the crowd of stunned, silent teenagers. He didn't look at the teachers who were now hurriedly dialing phones near the gymnasium doors. He walked back toward his Dinah, his boots crunching on the shards of broken headlight plastic. Russo, Dutch, and Huck followed him without a word. They mounted their bikes in unison. Silas hit the ignition. The V-twin roared to life, shaking the frame beneath him. He kicked it into gear, revved the throttle once, a deafening blast of exhaust that made a group of freshmen cover their ears, and pulled out of the blockade. They rode out of the parking lot exactly as they had arrived, tight, disciplined, and utterly untouched. The ride back to the south side was a blur of wind and adrenaline slowly burning out of Silas's bloodstream. The hot air dried the sweat on his neck. As they crossed the invisible boundary back into their territory, past the crumbling brick warehouses, the pawn shops, and the liquor stores with barred windows. The tension in Silas's shoulders finally began to uncoil. He had done it. He had crossed the line. He had put his hands on a cop's kid, vandalized a vehicle on school property, and done it in front of 50 witnesses. The fallout was going to be monumental, but as he gripped the handlebars, feeling the vibration of the road travel up his arms, he felt a strange, terrifying sense of peace. He had protected his own. The civilian world had failed Toby, so Silas had brought their world to the suburbs. They pulled into the gravel lot behind the clubhouse. The chain-link gates were pulled shut, secured by a heavy padlock. Gage's gray van was already parked near the back entrance. Silas killed the engine and kicked the stand down. Russo, Dutch, and Huck parked beside him. "You think the old man is going to send cruisers tonight?" Russo asked, taking his helmet off and running a hand over his bald, tattooed head. "Maybe," Silas said, pulling his keys from the ignition. "But Carter won't tell him the truth. He'll say we tried to steal the truck, or that we just attacked him. If he tells his dad why we were there, that he was extorting kids with a pipe, his old man will beat him worse than I did. Cops hate embarrassment more than they hate us." "Still," Dutch rumbled, cracking his neck, "I'll tell the prospect to keep watch at the gate tonight, just in case they feel froggy." "Appreciate it," Silas said. He left them in the lot and walked through the heavy steel rear door of the clubhouse. The interior was cool and dark, smelling of stale beer, pine cleaner, and old wood. The main bar was empty, save for the bartender wiping down the taps. Silas walked past the pool tables, heading down the narrow hallway toward the back office. The door was ajar. Silas pushed it open. Toby was sitting on a faux leather sofa. His right leg was propped up on a milk crate. His football pants were gone, replaced by a pair of oversized gray sweatpants Gage must have pulled from the lost and found bin. He held a plastic bag full of melting ice against his thigh. Gage was sitting in a rolling office chair across from him, cleaning the cylinder of a .38 revolver with a rag, entirely unbothered. When Silas walked in, Toby looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed, but he wasn't crying anymore. The fear was gone, replaced by a deep, quiet exhaustion. "Doc Henderson take a look?" Silas asked, leaning against the doorframe, crossing his arms. "Yeah," Toby muttered. He shifted his weight, wincing slightly. "No fracture, just a deep contusion. Muscle trauma. He gave me some anti-inflammatories. Said I can't run on it for 3 weeks." "No football," Silas confirmed. "No football," Toby agreed quietly. Gage snapped the cylinder of the revolver shut with a sharp click. "I'll give you 2 a minute," he grunted, standing up and sliding the gun into his waistband. He squeezed Silas's shoulder as he walked past, a silent acknowledgement of what had gone down. The door clicked shut, leaving the two brothers alone in the dim office. The silence stretched. It wasn't the terrified silence of the bleachers, nor the violent silence of the parking lot. It was the heavy, complicated silence of two people who didn't know how to talk about the things that mattered. Did you hurt him?" Toby finally asked, staring at the bag of ice on his leg. "I didn't break anything," Silas said. He walked over to the mini fridge in the corner, pulled out 2 bottles of water, and tossed one to Toby. He cracked his own open and took a long drink. "But he's not going to bother you again. None of them will." Toby caught the water bottle, his fingers tracing the condensation on the plastic. "He's going to tell his dad why. You're going to get violated." Silas walked over and sat on the edge of the heavy oak desk across from the sofa. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, looking directly at his little brother. "Toby, look at me." Toby raised his eyes. They were the exact same shade of dark brown as Silas's, but they still held a desperate, clinging innocence that Silas had lost a decade ago. "You don't protect me," Silas said, his voice softer than it had been all day. Stripped of the gravel, stripped of the anger. "That's not how this works. I protect you. That is the only rule in this family that matters. Mom couldn't do it, so I do it. You don't take a beating to keep me out of a cell. My choices are my own, you understand?" Toby's throat worked. He looked down at his lap, a tear finally breaking free and tracking through the dirt smudged on his cheek. He wiped it away angrily with the back of his hand. "I just wanted to be normal," Toby whispered, his voice cracking. "I just wanted to play football and not be the biker's kid for a few hours a day. But it doesn't matter. They always know. They always look at me like I'm trash." Silas felt an ache in his chest that had nothing to do with adrenaline or violence. It was a profound, suffocating sorrow. He had dragged this boy out of a trap house, put him in a decent school, bought him the cleats, signed the permission slips, and it still wasn't enough. The grease under the fingernails never washed out. It just stained everything you touched. Silas stood up. He walked over to the sofa and sat down next to Toby. The leather creaked under his weight. He didn't hug the boy. They weren't a hugging family. Instead, Silas reached out and rested his heavy, calloused hand on the back of Toby's neck, squeezing the base of his skull firmly. It was the exact same gesture he had used on the football field, but this time it held no anger, only an anchor. "We are who we are, Toby," Silas said quietly, staring at the blank wall across the office. "We don't get to be normal. Normal people let wolves eat them because they're too polite to scream. We aren't normal, but we aren't trash either. We're just the ones who bite back." Toby leaned slightly into the touch. It was a minuscule movement, almost imperceptible, but Silas felt it. "Does your leg hurt?" Silas asked. "Yeah," Toby admitted, his voice muffled. "Like hell. Good." "Remember how it feels," Silas said, his thumb brushing against the boy's hairline. "Next time a wolf asks you for a toll, you don't pay it. You look him in the eye, and you tell him exactly who your brother is." Outside the office, the muffled, rumbling sound of a motorcycle engine firing up echoed through the brick walls of the clubhouse. The world was still spinning. The consequences of the afternoon were still out there, waiting in the dark, preparing to crash down on them. Silas knew the cops would come eventually. He knew the peace he had bought today was fragile, bought on credit with a terrible interest rate. But as he sat there in the dim light, feeling the slow, steady rhythm of his brother's breathing beside him, Silas Hayes knew he would pay that price 1,000 times over. Grease never really washed out, but sometimes it was the only thing holding the engine together. By midnight, the heavy summer heat had finally broken, leaving behind a damp, clinging chill that smelled of incoming rain and ozone. The clubhouse had emptied out. Russo and Dutch took their bikes back to their own places across the river. Gage was asleep on a sagging plaid recliner in the corner of the main bar, his breathing a wet, ragged rattle. Silas hadn't slept. He sat on a plastic crate on the covered back porch, staring out across the gravel lot. The single floodlight above the heavy steel door buzzed with a relentless electrical hum, casting long, harsh shadows across the chain-link perimeter. He was smoking his third cigarette in an hour, watching the red cherry flare and fade. His knuckles throbbed. The adrenaline from the parking lot had entirely leached out of his system, leaving behind an ache that settled deep into the marrow of his bones. He was waiting for the sirens. Every time a dog barked down the block, every time a truck geared down on the distant interstate, the muscles in his neck tightened. He had a go bag packed in the locker room, $3,000 in cash, a burner phone, and a clean change of clothes. If the flashing red and blues lit up the gravel lot, he wouldn't fight. He'd just walk out with his hands up, taking the violation, taking the cell, so Toby wouldn't have to watch him get dragged face down through the dirt. But the sirens didn't come. Instead, at exactly 12:40 a.m., a single pair of halogen headlights cut through the darkness of the industrial road. Silas didn't move. He took a slow drag of his Marlboro, keeping the glowing tip cupped in his palm to hide the light. The vehicle didn't have a light bar on the roof, but the wide, heavy stance and the distinct whine of the alternator gave it away. It was an unmarked police interceptor, a dark gray Ford Explorer. It rolled to a stop outside the padlocked gate. The engine idled, a low, steady rumble that vibrated through the damp air. Silas stood up. He flicked his cigarette into a puddle of oily water where it died with a brief hiss. He didn't wake Gage. This wasn't club business anymore. This was family. He walked down the 3 wooden steps of the porch, his boots crunching loudly on the gravel. He stopped 10 feet from the chain link fence. The driver's side door of the Explorer opened. A man stepped out. He was tall, carrying the kind of bulk that used to be pure muscle but had softened over 20 years of riding a desk. He wore a rumpled gray suit with no tie. His silver hair was cropped close to his scalp. Lieutenant Davies, Carter's father. Davies slammed the door shut. He didn't unholster his service weapon, but his right hand rested deliberately on his belt, inches from the leather holster. He walked up to the fence, wrapping his thick fingers around the rusted chain link. "Hayes," Davies said. His voice was a flat, dead calm that was far more dangerous than yelling. It was the voice of a man accustomed to ruining lives with a single signature. "Lieutenant?" Silas replied, coming to a halt on his side of the fence. They stood face to face, separated only by intertwined steel wire. Up close, Davies smelled of stale coffee and peppermint antacids. His eyes were heavily bagged, bloodshot in the harsh glare of the floodlight. "You put your hands on my son today," Davies said. He didn't phrase it as a question. "I did." Silas didn't shift his weight. He didn't offer a defense. Explanations sounded like apologies, and Silas wasn't sorry. "You caved in the hood of his truck, smashed the lights, tore off the mirror." It needed a redesign. Davies's jaw clenched. The metal fence rattled slightly as his grip tightened. "I could have a SWAT unit breach that door right now, Hayes. I could have you face down on this gravel, cuffs biting into your wrists on your way back to solitary before your coffee gets cold. Parole violation, assault, destruction of property. You're a 2-time loser breathing free air only because the state lets you. Don't forget that." "I don't forget it," Silas said softly. He took a step closer to the fence. The air between them was electric, thick with the unsaid violence of two men who operated on opposite sides of the exact same coin. "So why aren't they here? Why are you standing alone in the dark?" Davies stared at him, his pale eyes narrowing. He didn't answer immediately. "Because you went home and looked at him," Silas answered for him, his voice a low, scraping rasp. "You went home, you saw the truck, and you asked him what happened. And Carter is soft, Lieutenant. He's soft and he's stupid. He cracked. He told you about the pipe. He told you about the toll." Davies's silence was a confession. The muscle in his cheek jumped. "He's an 18-year-old legal adult," Silas continued, mercilessly twisting the knife. "Extorting a 14-year-old minor on school property, assault with a deadly weapon, premeditated. You bring the squad down here to arrest me, I get violated, sure. But I got a lawyer who gets paid a hell of a retainer by this club. We subpoena the school cameras. We subpoena the medical records of my brother's leg. Carter goes to trial. How does a felony extortion charge look on his college applications, Davies? How does it look for your pending promotion to captain?" "You son of a bitch," Davies breathed, the professional detachment finally fracturing. "You think you can blackmail a police officer?" "I'm not blackmailing you," Silas said, utterly still. "I'm telling you the weather. You came out here to rattle my cage, to make sure I knew you had the power. But we both know you can't use it, not without burning your own house down." The crickets in the overgrown weeds at the edge of the lot stopped chirping. The silence stretched tight, a physical pressure pressing against the eardrums. Davies let go of the fence. He took a half step back, rubbing a weary hand over his face. He suddenly looked his age, stripped of the badge's armor. Just a tired father realizing his son was a coward. "I saw the pipe," Davies admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. It was a massive concession, a relinquishing of power. "I found it in the bed of the truck. Carter, he said it was just a joke, just hazing. My brother couldn't walk up the stairs today without wanting to vomit from the pain," Silas said, his tone devoid of gloating. He just presented the raw, ugly fact. It wasn't hazing, it was cruelty. He did it because he thought nobody would check him. He thought the badge on your chest was a shield for his bullshit. Davies looked down at the gravel. He kicked a loose rock with the toe of his polished shoe. "He's not a bad kid, Hayes. He's lost his way." "Then find him," Silas snapped, the first edge of real anger bleeding into his voice. before the street finds him, because if he pulls a stunt like that on someone outside the suburbs, they won't smash his headlights. They'll put him in the ground. Davies's head snapped up, his eyes flashing with a sudden protective fury. Are you threatening my boy? I'm giving you free advice, Silas said, locking eyes with the cop. I didn't break him today. I could have. I had the pipe in my hand and he was on his knees crying. I could have shattered his leg. I didn't. I hit the metal instead. That truck is the tax for what he did to Toby. We're square. Davies stood there for a long time, the rotating idol of the explorer the only sound in the night. The anger slowly drained out of the older man, replaced by a cold, pragmatic calculus. He was weighing the cost of vengeance against the cost of his son's future. The math was ugly, but it was absolute. Carter is transferring to Northside High next week, Davies finally said. His voice was flat again, all business. He won't be at Riverside. He won't be in the same zip code as your brother. Silas nodded slowly. Good. But hear me clearly, Hayes. Davies stepped forward, jabbing a thick finger through the chain link mesh. This ends here. If I see you in my jurisdiction again, if I even catch you riding down Main Street, I won't need an excuse. I'll pull you over, and I will find something to lock you up for. Am I understood? Crystal, Silas said. Davies stared at him for 3 more seconds, memorizing the scars, the ink, the dead-eyed stare. Then he turned around, walked back to the unmarked Explorer, and got in. He put the vehicle in reverse, backing out of the driveway without turning the headlights back on until he was halfway down the block. Silas watched the red taillights disappear around the corner. He didn't celebrate. There was no victory here, just the grim survival of another day. He pulled a new cigarette from his pack, clamped it between his teeth, and sparked his lighter. The flame briefly illuminated the deep lines around his eyes. He turned around and walked back across the gravel, the heavy steel door groaning as he pulled it open. The clubhouse was exactly as he left it. Quiet, smelling of stale hops and dust. Silas bypassed the bar and walked down the narrow hallway to the back office. He pushed the door open quietly. The single desk lamp was still on, casting a warm amber glow over the room. Toby was still on the faux leather sofa. He had fallen asleep, his head resting awkwardly against the armrest, his breathing shallow and even. The bag of ice had slipped off his leg, pooling water on the linoleum floor. Silas walked over. He picked up the melted ice bag and tossed it into the trash can. He reached down and pulled a rough wool club blanket from the back of the desk chair, unfolding it with a snap of his wrists. He draped the blanket over Toby, covering him up to his shoulders. As the wool settled over him, Toby stirred. His eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused in the dim light. He looked up at Silas, panic briefly flashing across his face before recognition set in. Why? Toby mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. Did they come? Silas stood over the couch. He looked down at the kid he had broken parole to protect, the kid who carried the weight of their cursed last name into pristine high school hallways. No, Silas said softly, reaching out and resting his heavy hand on the top of Toby's head, his fingers tangling briefly in the boy's messy hair. Nobody came. We're safe. Toby let out a long, shuddering exhale. His eyes closed again, trusting the lie, trusting the man who told it. Okay, good. Silas didn't move his hand until he was sure Toby was fully asleep again. He walked over to the desk, sat in the heavy oak chair, and leaned back into the shadows. He didn't close his eyes. He sat in the dark, watching the door, doing the only thing he knew how to do. He guarded the only thing he had left. If you felt the grit and loyalty in this story, don't leave Silas and Toby behind. Hit that like button to let the algorithm know you want more grounded, hard-hitting dramas that don't pull punches. Share this video with someone who understands what it means to protect family at all costs, even when it crosses the line. And if you crave more raw sensory storytelling without the cliché fluff, subscribe to the channel and ring the bell. We're dropping stories every week that live in the shadows. Drop a comment below. Did Silas go too far or not far enough? Let's talk about it.